Welcome back to the LGC Summit. Very pleased to see you all today. This is our penultimate session of this year's event. We're today talking about building local government for the next 10 to 20 years. We're expecting a really strong session today. Now, with this year's event, we're seeking to strike a balance between having all the benefits of the usual LGC Summit and all the possibilities of an online event. So the first half of today's events will feature contributions from some really important people from in and around local governments, which will be freely available on Swapcard, our online platform, after the event. The second half will be a Chatham House Rules question and answer session. We urge you to get fully engaged in that by sending some questions in. That part is Chatham House, so please do not disclose who is saying what or tweeting who's saying what after the event, because we want to have a free and open conversation about some of the big issues that we're all facing. If you do tweet about the event under those conditions, please use the hashtag LGC Summit. And also remember, using Swapcard, our platform, you can send connection requests to other people watching, and indeed you can have private video conversations with people, so please use that function. Just before I start, I just want to say thank you to our event sponsors, Capita, Local Partnerships, Safe as Houses, and the Local Government Information Units. Right, in a second, we will meet our speakers. So our first speaker today is Matt Prosser, the Chief Executive of Dorset Council. Pleased to see you, Matt. Over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Nick and the team at LGC for inviting me to speak on this quite enormous topic of building local government for the next 10 to 20 years. I'll try and do this some justice in just 7 minutes. I guess I could look back at the journey that I and my colleague Graham Farrant have been on in Dorset to bring 9 councils together to create 2 new unitary councils under the aptly titled bid Future Dorset. But if I look back to the start of my local government career in 1992, some 28 and a half years ago now, I remember that the topic of conversation at that time was, funnily enough, local government reorganisation. And for the last 13 years of my career, I've been in the thick of this, either through developing shared services, 2 council models, 3 council models, and now unitary councils. But the interesting part of that journey for me has been that throughout my local government career, there has always been change. And I guess our challenge as leaders of our organisation is, how do we respond to this personally? And of course, within a potential vacuum of political leadership nationally on the subject, leaving us to our own devices is always going to be potentially divisive. After all, as I'm sure we all know, it's very often difficult to motivate someone to be excited about change if their salary is dependent on the outcome of that change. And if you say to local government, you decide which model is best for your locality, guess what? You get multiple answers based invariably on the model of local government the correspondent knows best or is currently employed by. So how do we get that radical thinking to create local government fit for the 21st century? Madeleine Albright once said, we're taking 21st century challenges, evaluating them with 20th century ideas and responding with 19th century tools. And we are still offered 20th century if we're lucky, but probably more like 19th century solutions by our government to solve the problem. Not that that always stops us, but we need to have the drive and the ambition for our places locally to get the right outcome. What we do know in our heart of hearts is that local government now and in the future is about providing services for residents, our communities, and the businesses in our place that they need. And whilst conversations about the future shape of local government inevitably get bogged down in governance structures, the actual conversation should be, what can we do to improve the opportunities and the life of our people and our place? And when we've listened to our communities, then we should work out what governance model we need. In Dorset, we started by asking, what did our communities want us to do in our bid to government called Future Dorset? It was a chance to reset the local government landscape. But like all mergers or acquisitions, it's not simply a clean sheet. We had 204 elected members in the 6 predecessor councils, but now we have 82. Of those, 25 are brand new elected members. The others, 37, were previously county councillors or district councillors or both. But for those members who put themselves through that process of local government reorganisation, I think in the main there was a real desire to do things differently for and in Dorset. Similarly, we've invested a huge amount of time and energy in creating a new one-team culture with over 5,000 staff who tupied into the new council, working with staff to lead and own this process. by the organisation for the organisation, not just something dreamt up by the senior leadership team or even outside consultants, but by colleagues from across the organisation who understand why they're doing what they're doing. Just over 18 months in, and I can feel the difference in the business, but we'll continue to invest in our culture, our behaviours and our performance reporting as it is a continuous process. And finally, as a new authority, we looked at our digital aspirations, from members through to the frontline services, and what a decision that was, particularly for this year, enabling us as an organisation that was only 11 months old at the start of the national lockdown to move 2,500 employees to work at home without any technical issues. Moving member meetings online to webinars done weekly to keep members updated, voting, all done seamlessly. So here we are on our journey to become that future Dorset Council. And looking to that 10 to 20 year horizon, bearing in mind it took nearly 4 years just to create the new councils. And that, of course, is when the real work started. So what might Dorset or local government look like in 10 to 20 years, accepting the limitations that are likely to apply from rising demand for services versus ever reducing resources to fund work that comes from the centre? An effective and modern organisation. For me, that requires simplification, single point of contact, removing all of that duplication, data and technology at the heart, delivering better outcomes for users and reducing cost. We talk about being business-like with a social purpose, raising income in some areas to support work in others. For me, it's really important we've got digital and data at the heart of local government, removing some of our legacy systems that have held us back to creating modern and agile platforms for service delivery that meet the real-time needs of our communities. Performance dashboards that give that near real-time data to help us make quick, good, right decisions for our communities. My elected members in Dorset talk about being member-led, accountable but governance-light organisation. It's really important that we get that balance right. They're equipped to be advocates for the council but also champions for their place. Our customer-focused organisations, we want to be able to think big and act local is what we talk about in Dorset, to have a louder voice for our area rather than the 6 voices that didn't always agree, and so diluting the potential of the messaging to government or whoever we were talking to. But also to act local, remembering we are the service delivery organisation as well as a large strategic organisation. And finally, an employer of choice, modern culture, behaviours and continuous transformation and learning. Even during a global pandemic, we've been able to harness the benefits of the maturity of digital services by staff, communities, businesses. And hopefully, if legislation keeps pace with that, we'll continue to reap the benefits of this, from new ways of working through to reducing our estate to continuing to reduce the impact on the climate and local ecology. And finally, the overarching aim to be a sustainable organisation. I think we all aim to do that. And whilst it's been challenging for all local government colleagues during 2020, I have to say, being a unitary authority has helped to simplify our response, our costs and our communication to both residents and businesses. So finally from me, building local government for the next 20 years. I think the future Dorset model will stand us in good stead. It's simplified the local government landscape in Dorset for the benefit of residents, communities and businesses. It's also amplified the role of our towns and parish councils. We've got 163 in Dorset whom we work with closely, but it's also amplified our own voice within the locality, the region and nationally. For me, the opportunity to have the large majority of local government services under one metaphoric roof allows you to unlock the unique and untapped creativity of services, working together for the sole focus of the people and place that you serve. I think we have to accept that the model of local government created in 1974 is now perhaps not right for 2021. But getting where we have in Dorset has not been easy, and more leadership and direction from the centre would on this occasion probably have been helpful. Otherwise, left to our own devices, will be devices as I've already said. Councils in 10 to 20 years' time need to be singly focused on what's best for their people and place, particularly as we rebuild and reshape our economies post-COVID. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matt. Our second speaker today is Henry Murrison, Director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership.
Thank you, Nick. And I suppose I come as a friend to the sector and a former participant in it, which means I have a particular viewpoint, I suppose, of what the role of local government could be, but isn't today. And I think my challenge really is about the disjuncture between our economic destiny as a country. So we have a highly imbalanced economy in the UK, and large parts of not just the north of England, but other parts of the UK that have really struggled through deindustrialisation over the last decades and haven't really recovered from economic shocks from many decades ago, never mind the financial crisis or from what we're currently going through. And so it's in that context really that I think that local government has a key role, but I don't think it's the role it has today. And so if we start from first principles, a place is fundamental to bringing economic and social change. Yet in this country, far too many of the levers around our places are held in Whitehall. And so my sort of hope for the future is we will see a radical reshaping of the balance of responsibility between places and the centre. And as people like Bob Kerslake in the UK 2070 review have made very clear, that principle of making decisions at the lowest appropriate level, what's now unfashionably you could probably call subsidiarity. Obviously, it's EU associations make it unfashionable with some, but that principle that powers flow to the lowest possible level is about efficiency and about legitimacy as well. So the sense of powerlessness that many people in the country feel, and that I think was part of what motivated people to vote to leave the European Union, is not feeling like they can really affect those problems that I referred to at the start of my remarks. So not only do we have a huge economic dislocation in the country, but people feel they haven't got the tools or the opportunity to do anything about it. And so if we were going to reframe taking back control to be about what it could mean in terms of domestic UK policy and what it would mean in terms of the current situation we're in, I suppose my 20-year vision is that the process of devolution that I am a very strong advocate for, and Donna, who's on the call, obviously was a participant in, that devolution is central to the future role of local government. And so it isn't about local government doing more for less alone, and obviously efficiency is important, but it's about it doing more. So being responsible collectively for a lot more of public policy. And I think that that will drive reform around structures that enable government to have certainty that when they transfer powers and resources, there's both democratic legitimacy for that, but also the capacity to deal with these challenges. And I think the problem that combined authorities have helped to resolve is that there is a huge gap between the scale of central government policymaking and the level of local government and its resource. And so in parts of the country where this has been done successfully, and I would say Greater Manchester is a very good example, but there are examples outside the north, including the West Midlands, for instance, where actually creating, whether they've been newly created or have been actually evolved from previous collaboration, powerful and trusted actors that have got the capacity to take on things that should be done by people outside of Westminster, but that cannot be done at the level of the main tier authority for a place. And actually, if you were to agglomerate up, if you were to simply mix and match current central government powers with traditional local government functions, you wouldn't necessarily get local authorities that were small enough or relevant enough to deal with the problems that are actually genuinely local. And so what I want is a solution, I suppose, to the UK's question of regional inequality. And I want a solution to that because I think it has huge implications for many of our social challenges in our country, because as well as those regional economic divides, that absolutely compounds some of the social inequalities in our country. And if you go to the communities of County Durham and the legacy of the coal mines closing, it's young people in education who pay the price for that most acutely. And I want us to do something about that. And I don't think without significant structural change in our political structures, we can do that. Because I just think as long as decisions are made in silos from Whitehall, whether Whitehall is a road in London or a series of offices that open up across the country, it doesn't actually change the fundamental point that power needs to be decentralised if we're going to change the way our economy works. And I suppose our proposition to those, whether they're in the north of England or elsewhere, is that if we are going to have a recovery from this crisis that's a genuinely broad-based one that does build back better, as Andy Burnham coined the term, and it was kind of borrowed by the Prime Minister, a good example, hopefully, of the government's attitude towards some of this agenda, that what needs to happen is that we need to trust our metro mayors in particular and the combined authorities around them, because remember that as a group of individual men, they're not the most diverse group of people, but those combined authorities do capture a lot more talent and understanding and diversity of view and thought, actually, than just those individuals alone. But metro mayors, with their combined authorities, we think are the best actors to drive the economic recovery. And in places that haven't yet benefited from devolution, we need to accelerate the process of creating those empowered local authority actors, because I see those combined authorities and their constituent members as being absolutely in partnership and tied together. And I think that only when we can move many more strategic functions from Whitehall and funding over key areas like skills and transport out of Whitehall, and I would argue collaborate across larger economic geographies like the Western Gateway across the English and Welsh border through to the Northern Powerhouse, but based on democratic legitimacy, that we can also transfer more powers back to local government. And I suppose my kind of earliest memories really of being in the sector are of being a champion when I was a local councillor in my misspent youth, trying to devolve power to very local communities to give people a say over their own place and where they lived. And I absolutely think that creating empowered partnerships in local government between authorities working collectively and voluntarily, but then receiving the real powers and authority and funding they need, is a real shot in the arm, actually, for then enabling local government at the level of the core of that, the building block, to also share power with constituents, with people, with communities, and with those institutions that make up local places. And so I think that is a model for decentralisation. It's a radical one, but I think it's the way we have to go.
Great, thank you, Henry. Our third speaker is Sean Hanson, the Chief Executive of Local Partnerships.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have been asked to give you my reflections, and I'll make 5 quick points, and I hope it doesn't come across as being too gloomy. We've already talked about crises, so I'll hit on where we are. Given the amount of time and energy that Local Partnerships has placed recently on promoting strong and decisive leadership in responding to climate change, including sponsoring the LGC's conference a few weeks ago, you won't be surprised that I'll start with the climate emergency. The government has published this week its plan for a green industrial revolution, and its timeliness and its content is so utterly relevant for the topic that we're discussing that I think it's important to highlight some of its content, the pledges, and frankly the potentially missed opportunities when we think about addressing the challenges for local government over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. Some of the things that your politicians and your teams will need to wrestle with over the next couple of decades are highlighted in the Green Industrial Revolution and its plan. It's very technologically driven, with little reference to behavioural or societal change, so you'll have to think about those things. But it's important that we also think about where those technologies, the Green Revolution technologies, will be deployed. Take the mentions of hydrogen and its use in energy production. Both the introduction of mass hydrogen and carbon capture aim to reduce emissions by around 18%. We skirt over the fact that these technologies are unproven as yet and not yet cost effective. Which of your boroughs, which of your cities, which of your areas are going to provide the raw materials? Where will the jobs be? And which of you is going to capture and store the carbon? I only use this as an example of the new things that we need to think about, and this week's Green Industrial Revolution paper refers to other new initiatives: offshore wind, nuclear, small-scale nuclear. Which of your planning teams is ready for the process of deciding where the small nuclear facilities are going to be? And again, who's going to store the waste? I'm sure you're already working on your strategies for vehicle and fleet electrification and all the associated infrastructure that goes with it. So you don't need me to point out that your responses and plans for the next 20 years will need to address increasingly aggressive carbon reduction targets. You'll also, though, have to plan for greater resilience and adaptation. Extreme weather events, rising sea levels. My point number 1 is that building local government over the course of the next 10 to 20 years will have a consistent thread from start through to finish, and that is your response to climate change. It will be a constant, and it will require constant planning and preparedness for adaptation. The second point I'd like to mention is our preparedness or otherwise for other emerging crises, disaster recovery and business continuity. The response to the current pandemic has been heroic, and local government has, of course, been magnificent in the way it's responded and demonstrated leadership through the crisis. But the pandemic is not our only crisis. As has been mentioned, there's a building economic crisis, there's a housing crisis, a care home crisis, a crisis of isolation and of loneliness. We face tough choices, particularly if the spending review is as unkind as we think it might be. So, although I'm a glass half full person, I'm generally really optimistic. We need to be pragmatic and realistic too. We need to look at our risk management and our continuity plans and building into our plans for the future and for the next 10 to 20 years, something will go wrong. And we are, as a sector, brilliant at dealing with crises. And I'm in awe of colleagues here today who have to spin all their respective plates. I'd simply suggest that as a sector, we plan ahead a bit too, as well as responding. We need to recognise that we're at our best when we retain the ability to adapt and respond flexibly. My third point is to mention distressed local authorities. This week we've heard about Croydon, and last week, and I see that according to SIPFA today, the press, that Bexley's asked for a relaxation of its rules around capital as well, an all too familiar request these days. We've tried many forms of intervention and assistance, and the LGA plays a very significant role in helping with sector-led improvement. And I encourage you to get behind the LGA and Solace, as they are absolutely critical in helping those distressed councils and your distressed and overworked colleagues trying to make improvements. I learned so much from my time with Donna as an advisor in Birmingham over the last year, watching as colleagues gave over so much sage advice and wise counsel. And if there's a reflection that I wanted to pass on this third point, on relating to building local government over the next 10 to 20 years, is that we have an abundance of colleagues who want to help, ask, listen, and sector-led improvement will improve things for the sector. My fourth point is to do with arm's length organisations, council companies, joint ventures, PPPs and various partnerships. We have examples of Croydon with Brick by Brick, which is the press. We've got Nottingham with Robin Hood Energy. We've plenty of examples of PPPs that resulted in terrible overspends. One of the more obvious things that we have experienced at local partnerships is that there's a very fine balance between calculated risk and recklessness. I remember once going for a job and going through assessments and profiling, and I scored very high on the spectrum for risk taking. And when I was challenged for my high propensity for risk, my answer was very straightforward. I do love jumping out of airplanes, but I learned to do it with an instructor who had jumped thousands of times out of planes before, and I had a parachute on my back. There's a common feature with my point 3, and that is the transparency and a willingness to accept external advice and scrutiny. I and some of my colleagues at local partnerships have the pleasure of being invited to a number of formal boards as non-executive advisors, observers. We provide the same function as NEDs do for private companies, and I know that some of you do this too. We need to be doing more of that in the next 10 to 20 years to build local government over the next couple of decades. If we're going to learn anything from the private sector, anything at all, it's that our governance does not work if we stuff boards with amateurs. We don't disclose and offer up to scrutiny our board decisions, and we allow ourselves to let our council-owned companies to take unreasonable risks with the public purse. Over the next 10 to 20 years, we'll be setting up more of these companies, we'll be setting up more joint ventures, and perhaps we'll be using assets to generate electricity, linking your climate actions to commercialisation. To build the next 10 to 20 years on strong foundations, we need to invite other people in and take professional advice wherever we can get it. Let's use instructors who jumped thousands of times, and let's make sure we wear the parachutes. If you haven't already read it, I'd commend Paul Dossett's article in the most recent LGC. It summarises well the view of the risks that some councils are taking when they set up commercial and trading organisations. Lastly, Tom Stannard from Wakefield said on Wednesday that job roles will change out of all recognition, and I couldn't agree more. There'll be healthier, long-lived lives, is what he said, and I agree. I just want to re-emphasise Tom's point that successful authorities will embrace that change. Matt's already mentioned it, and it's been mentioned by Henry. They'll encourage and reskill their own employees and influence the change in their localities. Building local government for the next 10 to 20 years, we'll need to recognise that we need to adapt. The best of us will be in the vanguard. Hopefully, the rest of us will try and keep up. If I have a plea for my colleagues in organisations like us, particularly when it comes to sector-led improvement, it's to help each other and make sure that local government is built on strong foundations for the next 10 to 20 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Our fourth panellist today is Donna Hall, the Chair of New Local.
Thanks very much, Nick, and hi everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come and chat with you today. It's a shame we can't see each other in real life. The question is a really, really fascinating one and a huge one that everyone is grappling with at the moment, I think. But I was wondering whether, is it about building local government over the next 10 to 20 years, or is it about thinking around about the role of place over the next 10 to 20 years, and thinking about the changing shape of local government being more around the convener of place and enabling all the community, the fantastic assets that we've got in our communities to come to the fore. So Henry's nicked half my speech, but never mind, I'll try to continue anyway. I still think we'll be here as a sector, definitely within the next 10 to 20 years. And I remember once when we were in the middle of a really fraught discussion with our clinical commissioning group in Wigan, I remember someone very sagely saying to me, look, don't worry, the only two things that will still be here in 20 years' time will be the council and the hospital. So, thinking about how we work together with our NHS partners in the place is really, really important, I think. So I do think it's much more around how hospitals, councils, the police, other significant organisations like universities will be there to hold the place together as key anchor institutions and to bring forward the power of community, to be more enablers, more facilitators of community power. So I think we will still be here, but we will be in a different form and we'll be a lot smaller as well. So going back to something that Henry said earlier on, we live, and I'm not sure if people are fully aware of this and whether people have looked at other models in other parts of the world, but the way that we are run as a nation within the UK, certainly within England, is we are more centralised than others, anywhere else, I think, in the whole of the world, apart from perhaps North Korea. And certainly Whitehall tends to act more as a manager of targets rather than a leader. So I think what we would be looking for within local government as conveners of place would be a much more of a kind of tight, loose arrangement with central government. So place is where the silos of Whitehall kind of come together, and it's the only way that we can connect the silos of Whitehall around place. So I am hoping that we would see more meaningful devolution with government providing that leadership in a tight way around objectives and outcomes, but leaving localities to manage that and to work differently with local residents and bring all the partners together, almost like they have done in the German federal model, where you've got people working together. You've seen how effective that was with test and trace in the early days of COVID-19 within Germany, where they managed to trace every outbreak of the disease right down to a very fine-grained level, where we were still struggling at that point, setting up a duplicatory, outsourced, centralised test and trace system, which duplicated what you all run within your public health teams and what our NHS laboratories have the capacity to do. So making sure that we build on that localised model. In other parts of the world, those localities, those federal states have economic powers to raise taxes, and that's what we should be lobbying for when we're going for devolution. So I do think this whole idea of integrated care systems is going to take off much more in the next 10 to 20 years. Some places are already experimenting with that at the moment. But I do think that is going to be really coming to the fore. Provider collaboratives across NHS providers are going to be key, and a merging of clinical commissioning groups, that's definitely going to take place as well. But I think rather than having them as very top-down, paternalistic, integrated care systems, let's think about them more as integrated community systems. There'll still be ICSs, but the middle letter will be community, not care, and thinking about how we can use the brilliant assets that we've got within our local communities. I don't think the NHS and local government are separately sustainable on their own. I think we've got to come together and form new organisations at the local level and rethink our role as enabler, not just as provider. So a much sharper focus on prevention, a much sharper focus on population health. So even pre-COVID, we could see for the first time ever in 40 years, population health and healthy life expectancy declining across the UK, which is really, really worrying. So, and I do see that the link, and I think we all do, between the economy and health. If we've not got a healthy, fit and well workforce, whether it's mentally fit and well or whether it's physically fit and well, we're not going to be able to compete in the global economy. So we've really got to focus on prevention and on building on a leadership, a kind of united vision of leadership for the place and a united common sense of purpose across leaders within the place. I think I was speaking to a chief executive. He might be on the at the event today. I won't name him, but a large authority. And he was saying the other day that he employs at the moment 2,000 assessors to just assess people. And that begs the question, what are we getting wrong here? Why are we doing this repeated assessment of people rather than actually connecting with them in a different way and providing seamless services to support the most vulnerable or valuable, as we like to call them, within our communities, and really trying to think differently about our role as enabler and bringing forward the assets that we've got in our places, rather than seeing people as an individual unit of need and just dealing with them with that one presenting need. Let's think differently about our role. I think also, given what's happened to cities through the pandemic, we've seen the kind of emergence of towns and this whole idea of kind of commutable towns, where we've got towns developing and better connected with digital to being places where people like to move to out of cities. So I'm on the board of the Centre for Towns, and we're really keen to push the whole role of towns into the future. I also think there's a whole new role for councillors, for elected members, as kind of key spark plugs, as the connector with the community, and trying to think about their role of bringing that bringing what people really feel back into the organisation, and thinking about councillors being more representative of the communities they serve. Some councils are brilliant at that, others less so. Similarly as well, us as leaders, chief executives need to be much more reflective of the communities that they serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. So at this point, we're going to turn off our recording.